Lovely. Without further ado, I'll ask Charles to introduce our guest this evening. Thank you.
Well, firstly, Lee, thanks for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming this evening. And thanks particularly to you, Mr. Speaker, for giving your time this evening. I should just say I checked with Mr. Speaker in the car about what I should call you in this conversation. And as you rightly say, we've known each other for 20 years. And after this first introduction, I'm going to call you John, if that's all right. But the reason that Mr. Speaker is always called Mr. Speaker, even in most informal situations in the Palace of Westminster, is it's a tremendously significant office which has a tremendous history in our whole evolution of the country. And there is, amongst parliamentarians of all political sides, tremendous respect for the office, and that method of address is one of the means of demonstrating that. Now, you've had an extraordinary life, John. You were born and brought up in North London, in Edgware. You went to the local comprehensive school. You then came into the political stream, and I'm going to ask you about that. But let me just ask you at the beginning one aspect of your background. You came from a Jewish family in Edgware in North London. And it says in the Wikipedia, I don't know if it's true, that your father's, your grandparents on your paternal side, on your father's side, had fled to this country from Romania about 100 years ago. And so, of course, you had a very personal family experience of the refugee experience and how it had been through the whole of the way you'd been brought up. And then during your period as Speaker, it's been a very big issue in your life and how you deal with the questions in Parliament and so on. Can you just talk a little bit about how it felt coming from a family with that personal history that had led you, you've been brought up in that history? Talk a little bit about what happened to them, how they came to this country, how they made out what happened and how the country treated them in your own personal experience when you were born.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. And by the way, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here, and I always enjoy dialogue. I don't want it to be a mutual admiration society, but I like Charles, I respect Charles. Some people are parliamentarians, other people are men or women of government. Charles was both. Well, not a woman of government, but he was a man. And so when he floated the idea that I might come here, I was immediately and instinctively attracted to it, and you're missed. And so I think it's hugely significant that you're able still to contribute to the public debate. The short answer to your question, and then there's a slightly fuller one, is that I'm not naturally incurious, rather the opposite, but I know embarrassingly little about the circumstances that brought my paternal grandparents here. I never met them. They died before I was born. And my late father, though a very good father in all sorts of ways, tended really to clam up about the past, particularly insofar as he found it painful to recall. He was quite a brave character in many ways, but he didn't really want to discuss it. And I feel I missed out a bit. I'm not blaming him, and it's far too late for him to do anything about that, as he passed away in October 1986. But he didn't really talk about it at all. And I suppose the overriding feeling, Charles, that one has as a result of being the child or grandchild of migrants is that of being an outsider. Now, I'm saying this for better or for worse, and people judging me as they judge everybody in public life, warts and all, making their own assessment. You may think, well, why on earth do you feel like an outsider? You know, you were born here, you were born into not an affluent but a moderately comfortable home. You're not actually a migrant yourself, you're not the son of migrants, you're the grandson of migrants whom you never met. All I can say is that I have always felt myself to be something of an outsider. The Jewish community in North London is not small, but it is nevertheless a minority community, and I certainly encountered anti-Semitism to a degree at school, and what I would call soft and latent anti-Semitism more widely. So I think I've always felt, I hope I haven't got, and certainly shouldn't now have, a chip on my shoulder, but I've always felt conscious of being an outsider and of the need to some extent to do that bit better, to get on or feel that I've achieved what perhaps my father would have wanted me to achieve. I think probably the most shaming feature of it all, and it is a shaming feature of it all, is that in my early political characterization, I took a stridently right-wing position, not just on economic matters, but on immigration. And to this day, although I don't generally find it terribly difficult to express myself, and I hope I'm not normally characterized by completely stuttering incoherence in response to any remotely penetrating inquiry, I cannot explain how it could possibly be that in the early 1980s I was attracted to the Monday Club, which is a particularly unattractive fringe group within the Conservative Party, indeed on its outskirts. The only possible explanation I think I can offer, you haven't quizzed me about it, but I'm volunteering the view anyway, is that I was always very interested in, drawn to, and attracted by people whose intellects I thought were very powerful, and if, to boot, they had fantastic rhetorical or oratorical skills, that added to my interest. And you might say, oh, well, if you interpret that literally, you could have been interested in or attracted to Hitler. Well, no, because Hitler was bestial and Hitler was manifestly the worst anti-Semite in global history. But I was at that time rather attracted to Enoch Powell, and I regret that very much now. But at the time I thought, A, this guy is very bright, B, he's a fine speaker, and C, and I think that this is often a characteristic of young people of whatever background or community, there is a rigorous, systematized set of thoughts. The great simplicities, the notion that there might be shades of grey, was not a feature of Enoch Powell's thinking as far as one could tell, and certainly not of his public pronouncements. And I thought, gosh, this guy's thought it all through, and this brand of conservatism is very appealing. It may also be that the fact that I was a pretty diminutive figure and often subject to baiting or even bullying at school led to me asserting myself almost as a counter-reaction in that way. So I'm not proud of that, but that's the best and most honest answer I can give you.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, what's striking, knowing you and reading about you, is how early you became involved in politics, actually, and then you had, as you've just described, quite a complicated journey in terms of your beliefs, which I will pursue in a second. But the thing which really amazed me when I read about you, and you made a reference to it when you kindly launched the book that Toby James and I had been editing in your apartment at the House of Commons, was that you had been, it says this, can this really be true, Britain's #1 junior tennis player when you were a young boy, even, not even young man. Is that really right? And you said you'd written a book about tennis players as well. And it was something I just never knew about you at all, despite having thought I knew you quite well. And does my cod psychology say that this was you being very, very competitive, perhaps for the reasons you've just said, and wanting to beat others in this way? And then you were brought down by, I think, glandular fever, which meant you couldn't proceed to the levels that you wanted to achieve. But it's a rather surprising thing in your... Tell us about the tennis.
Well, it is true, but largely irrelevant. It is true that I was, Charles, no, not at all, briefly ranked #1 as a British junior tennis player. The reason why it's largely irrelevant is that I was 12. So it didn't last very long. But actually the background to that is of minor interest, and people will make their own judgment about whether any of what I have to say is of interest, but the background is perhaps of minor interest because, put very simply, Charles, my mother came from a very poor background, and she grew up in Huddersfield in the 1930s, and she was the child of a single mum, which was comparatively unusual then. A very good mum, a very loving mum, a very devoted mum, but also a very poor, impecunious mum who scarcely had 2 brass farthings to rub together. So she showered mum with love, but she was living on her uppers all the time. So mum was poor, mum was a voracious reader, but she never had a chance to do anything by way of activities that involved money. She could do things in the home and indeed in the local park or whatever, but anything, singing lessons, piano lessons, ballet lessons, sports lessons, which other people from more affluent families took as a matter of course, just as they do in every generation, mum didn't take. So when in the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, my parents were modestly prosperous, and I'm not saying that, you know, to be understated about it, that's all it was. They weren't rich, but they were modestly well off. Mum was very, very keen that my sister Alison, who's my older sister by 2.5 years, and I should have the chance to do things that would be fun, and she wanted us both to develop an interest or a hobby. It didn't matter what it was. Goodness knows, I went through the mill. I went to Cubs and Scouts, which I heartily detested personally because I deplored and loathed orienteering and had no sense of direction then or now. I went to judo, at which I was spectacularly maladroit. But I went swimming. My sister proved to be a synchronised swimmer and swam for Britain. I developed an interest in tennis at the local tennis club, the Finchley Manor Tennis Club in Lyndhurst Gardens, N3, and subsequently took lessons, including eventually from Bobby Wilson, who was the British #1 tennis player for a period in the 1960s. So I got really into tennis. I was ferociously competitive, and I played competitively until the age of about 15. It's always said that it was glandular fever, but actually it was a rather severe bronchial asthma that brought me down one winter, and I was scarcely able to train or practice. And I wasn't able to make the grade, and I subsequently qualified as a coach. I've always been much amused, and it is a commentary on what a gentlemanly quality he has, that if ever Andrew Castle, who was once British #1 tennis player and is a regular tennis commentator, sees me in the crowd at Wimbledon, he tends to reference the fact that I was the #1 seed at the Nationals tournament at Eastbourne in 1975. And I did on one occasion say to him, Andy, of course, that is entirely true, but you neglected to point out that although I was the #1 seed, I was in fact knocked out of the tournament. And he said, John, superfluous information.
So now on to politics. I just was so amazed by that I just wanted to ask you, and thank you for telling us. You went to Essex University, you got a first-class degree in politics. Professor Anthony King taught you, Tony King, a very distinguished lecturer, professor, writer, and he says of you, as a young activist, Bercow was a member of the right-wing Conservative Monday Club, which you mentioned a second ago. But when he was a student here, he was very right-wing, pretty stroppy, and very good. He was an outstanding student. So obviously you made an impact there, not just by your politics, but by your assiduity and your strength as a student. And for somebody like Tony King to give you that kind of praise is quite something. Why did you get involved in Conservative politics? I'm not asking the Monday Club question. Why not Labour? Why not Liberal? Why not some other group? What was it about you and your life which led you to choose, firstly, to choose politics at all, rather than tennis or the other things you were doing, but secondly, having chosen politics, which you did at a relatively young age, you thought Conservative politics was where you wanted to be?
There were 2 factors, one negative and one positive, which had an impact on me before ever I'd got to university. In the winter of discontent, 1978-79, we had streets unswept, sick people untreated, and dead people unburied. There was a wave of strikes across the public sector. And at that time, which was the inception of my political consciousness, if you will, I thought this is a lousy state of affairs. The country has become virtually ungovernable. And at that time, and I think that this is further evidence, and there are many other sources of evidence, that I was rather a rebellious school student, most of my teachers at the Finchley Manor Hill Comprehensive School were either supporters of the Callaghan government or they were left-wing Bennite critics of it. But there were several noughts after the decimal point before you reached a positive finger if you were trying to calculate how many Conservatives there were amongst the teachers there. And I thought, this is a rotten way to run a country. The government has completely lost control. The unions are calling the shots. And to me, they were abusing the country and disfiguring the economy and damaging our prospect of prosperity. That was the negative factor that got me really interested. The positive factor was that although I didn't live in her constituency, I attended school, Finchley Manor Hill, in Margaret Thatcher's constituency, and I met her, and I have to say that I was very inspired by her. My views over a period of years, as is well known, have changed, although I continue to admire Mrs. Thatcher. I think she was a formidable and transformative Prime Minister, rather in the way that you could certainly say, and most would, that Attlee was a transformative Prime Minister. She did something with her power, and she didn't deploy all her meteorological skills to discover which way the wind was blowing and then promptly tack in that direction in order to meet the popular fashions of the day. She held views and could be relied upon to enunciate them, tacking and weaving a bit for tactical purposes, of course, but broadly sticking to a strategic view. I met her, I think it was on April the 30th, 1979, but it was either April the 30th or May the 1st, 1979, at her last meeting in the Finchley constituency, not sadly at my school, but at the Woodhouse Grammar School, before polling day. I went along to her. I suppose I must have been A, fairly determined, and B, pretty pushy, because I went to listen to her speech. I was much inspired by it, and I thrust myself forward and managed to get introduced to her at the end, and I professed my commitment. I said, unfortunately, I won't be able to vote on Thursday because I'm only 16, etc., etc. Whereupon she interrupted my flow by saying, yes, but are you a member of the Young Conservatives? And I said, well, I'm afraid I'm not yet, Mrs. Thatcher, but I have come tonight and I greatly admire you. And said, well, you most assuredly should be, she said. And she said to me, and I was always very struck by this, I got to know her a bit better in later years, but she said to me, do you know Roy Langstone? And this name meant nothing to me, and I said, I'm afraid I don't, Mrs. Thatcher. He's my agent, an absolutely first-class man. 221 Ballards Lane is the office of the Finchley and Frown Barnet Conservative Association, where he's based. I strongly advise you to go there, and he will see you right, she said. Whereupon I did what most members of Mrs. Thatcher's cabinets, if they valued their life, tended to do, which was to follow her instructions. And, you know, it went from there. I got involved in the YCs, and at university, therefore, if I was going to get involved, it was bound to be with the Conservative Association. The University of Essex at the time had a strong left-wing bias amongst students, and, you know, did that bother me? No, on the contrary, as you can rather imagine, Charles, it energised me greatly. The prospect of going in front of union general meetings and proposing motions which were going to cause intense anger on the left, calling for a concerted campaign in favour of the nuclear deterrent and against CND, and a miscellany of other motions to which I put my name and gave my voice, I found extremely stimulating. The fact that I was pretty ritually abused on one occasion in the student union bar, a feminist student pouring a pint of beer over my head, only added to the interest.
And, Julie, you became the National Chairman of the Federation of Conservative Students. You went up and down the country in the Conservative cause, trying to win over people. What were you mostly involved in that kind of work? Was it arguing, making the case? Was it tactics and positioning? Was it ideologically developing your thought process about the challenges facing the country? What type of activity were you engaged in at that time?
Really three things. I was trying to boost Conservative student numbers across the country, which, to be honest, we did. I mean, the Conservative students were, in some universities, even the silent majority. In a lot they weren't, but their numbers, and I think people would empathise with this point, or at least understand this point, their numbers were often far greater than public pronouncements would suggest. I know I'm making a rather sweeping point here, but broadly speaking, as the late T.E. Utley used to say, Conservatives are not accustomed to defending their beliefs. They simply believe them. And quite a lot of Conservatives were silent Conservatives, or they were very active members of sports clubs, the rugby club or whatever it may be, or they enjoyed going to discos or pursuing a variety of hobbies, or indeed pursuing the opposite sex, as the case may be. But, you know, they weren't particularly active. So I tried to increase numbers and increase the numbers of activists. I was very much developing my own thought processes, which by then had moved on from objectionable Monday Club authoritarianism and moved very much in the direction of free market economics. I was very attracted to what Mrs. Thatcher was doing and so on. The European issue wasn't a big issue at that time, but concepts of markets and of competition and of trying to scale down the state industrial sector were very important features. And if I'm really honest, Charles, you know, and let's not overstate it, I did feel passionately, I did feel there were great issues of principle. I did think that one day I would like to be a member of Parliament championing important causes and representing a territory. But, you know, I was an ambitious little bugger. I wanted to get on. And, you know, I think very often people cloak their ambition and sort of say, well, you know, I was high-mindedly pursuing X and Y. Well, up to a point I was, but I was also ambitious. I wanted to get on and prove myself.
Well, I've just got one more question about that before your entry to Parliament. You did a number of things. You were on Lambeth Council, you were Deputy Leader of the Conservatives on Lambeth Council, you were a special advisor to a couple of Conservative cabinet ministers. You tried for parliamentary seats. You ran in 1987 in the Labour seat of Motherwell South, 1992 the Labour seat of Bristol South. Before finally you were adopted for Buckingham, having, it's reported, but I find it difficult to believe it's true, hired a helicopter to go between the Buckingham safe seat and the Surrey Heath safe seat, both of which you were trying to go for but had their selection on the same night. You wanted to be able to go for both of them. It's quite impressive that you did that, and you're described as saying it was the best £1,000 you ever spent in your life. But is that ambition? It's quite tough. You run for a seat and you're beaten in Motherwell in 1987. You run for another seat, Bristol in 1992, and you're beaten. But you still kept going. This ambition was there until you were selected for a safe Conservative seat, which you now still represent. What was it in you that said, despite these setbacks, I'm just going to keep going and really make it happen for myself?
An absolute conviction that this was what I would enjoy and find rewarding more than any other possible competing career. And equally, and I know this sounds very arrogant, but it seems to me these conversations are pointless unless one is candid, an absolute conviction that eventually I would get there. You're right, I fought and lost in Motherwell South. I did get 5,702 votes and 14.5% of the votes. I didn't lose my deposit, but I was obviously comprehensively mauled by Dr. Jeremy Bray, who was the Labour member for the constituency. And then in Bristol, I think I got a little in excess of 16,000 votes, but I was slaughtered by Dawn Primarolo. In fact, you know, look, there's no pain about this. I had an estranged uncle, estranged principally from my father, whom I never met. And he died some years ago, but he did at one point, I never met him, he did at one point, he had various difficulties and problems in his life, but he did at one point write to me to note that I had started fighting the seat when Labour had a majority of 1,404, when Dawn first came in 87, and that as a result of me fighting the seat, or at any rate after I had done so in 1992, the Labour majority had risen to 8,919. So my Uncle Sam said to me, your performance confirms the opinion that I hold of you. And my mother at the time, you know, was most upset about this. I probably shouldn't have told her I'd got the letter, but Mum was most upset, and it was sort of instinctive anger, I suppose. She wanted me to write to him, telling him his fortune and so on. And I said, no, I'm absolutely not going to do that, Mum. Absolutely not, because that will give him satisfaction. I shall ignore it. You just sort of rise above it as an absurd letter for somebody of his age to send. So no, I didn't, but I got hammered there. No, what kept me going, I really felt that it was what I wanted to do, that I would be good at being a parliamentarian, and that I would get there. Now, when I eventually got selected, my mother, again, sorry to keep invoking her, but she said to me, I'm so pleased. Alison, who's my older sister, said to me recently, I'm quite worried about John spending so much time and quite a lot of money that he can ill afford travelling around the country trying to find a constituency, Conservative Association, to select him, because I just feel that if in the end he fails, he's going to be terribly disappointed. And Mum said, I'm only telling you this now because I didn't want to upset you before. And I said, well, it wouldn't have upset me, Mum, but I have to say, appreciate my sister's loyalty and support and interest and concern, but the thought that I would eventually fail, to be honest, literally never occurred to me. Absolutely not once. No, I always thought in the end it would happen. And there was a man called Fred Sylvester, who was a very nice, rather middle-of-the-road, moderate Conservative MP from Manchester Withington, who lost his seat in 87, I think he served from, 74 to 87 or thereabouts. And I remember Fred once encouraging me when I was seeking selection, and he said, John, just remember, you only have to be lucky once. You only have to find a fit with the constituency once. Finally, Charles, forgive me, but on the point about the helicopter, no, that historical recollection or report that you came across is absolutely true. It was wretched incompetence on the part of the South East Area Conservative Central Office that they arranged these two selection meetings, which both fell within the party's South East region on the same night. Surrey Heath was a semi-final. It wasn't being decided that night, but it was going from 6 to 3. And Buckingham was a final. They were making the choice. So I said to the Conservative Central Office agent when he said to me, sorry, John, but the bad news is, the good news is you've been selected for further interview. The bad news is you'll have to pull out on one of them. I said, no, absolutely not. And he said, well, I'm sorry, but we'll have to because it's not manageable to do them both. And I said, well, look, I was, with great respect, David, shows you what an awkward bugger I am. I said, with great respect, I was voted through in each, and I simply want the chance to compete. And I said, all it requires, he said, no, but it's not workable. I said, well, it is workable. All it requires is a degree of cooperation. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, if I'm allowed to go on first in Surrey, and I'm allowed to go on last in Buckingham, the rest can be managed. John, he said, the roads have got snow on them. You know, it's just not deliverable. And he said, how are you going to manage it? And I said, leave that to me. And so anyway, they did kindly agree, first in Surrey, last in Buckingham. And as to the logistics, I put my very good friend, Dr. Julian Lewis, who's now the MP for New Forest East, onto that, because Julian observes in every aspect of his life the pedantry pays principle. That is to say, he goes about organisation in an extremely pedantic and painstaking manner. And he said, look, John, you concentrate on deciding what you're going to say and anticipating possible lines of questioning. I will organise it. So Julian organised the helicopter, the taxi pickup in a field in Finmere and all the rest of it. And I got there. When I subsequently told my runner-up, Howard Flight, who got into Parliament in any case, that I had cracked a joke, a very corny and prosaic joke about how I had arrived tonight, not by road, not by rail, but by flight, which was extremely cheap and corny, I know. And Howard Flight was intensely irritated with me. But some 19 years later, I think he's forgiven me.
Okay, so you were in Parliament, elected in 1997. It was a Labour landslide. You were obviously picked early on to do well. You were a member of the opposition front bench and part of the leadership team of the Conservative opposition. And that went through that first Parliament, but then in November 2002, you resigned the whip on a very interesting issue, which was that the government had put forward a vote which permitted unmarried, both gay and heterosexual couples to adopt children. And that was part of the overall legislative programme. But the leadership of the Conservative Party, Ian Duncan Smith, put down a 3-line whip, which meant you had to vote against that proposal from the government. And you wouldn't accept that. You felt the issue was so important to you that you would stand out against it. You resigned the whip, you left the front bench. And that, I mean, it wasn't, I couldn't just describe it as natural stroppiness. There was an issue of some important principle to you here, which led you to feel you had to go against your Conservative colleagues. Can you just talk us through that and why you took that decision then and how that came about?
Yes, I mean, I think it was in a sense a natural extension, Charles, of a thought process that had gone on over a period of years on the specific issue of LGBT equality. I had first decided to change my mind and my vote on the subject of the equal age of consent in February 2000. And Tim Boswell, who was a rather liberal, patrician, Conservative MP who'd long been a supporter of an equal age of consent, said to me, John, you know, if you feel that way, can I offer you a word of advice? And I said, yes, please do, Tim. And he said, if you've changed your mind, he said, I think it would be very good if you spoke in the debate. The House likes to hear about the rationale for a member's change of heart. And so I did. And I confess, in my probably slightly anarchish and intense way, I became very focused on that issue and other issues that I thought were part, Charles, of an explanation for why the Conservative Party had developed a very unattractive reputation, famously dubbed, as you will recall, by Theresa May, the nasty party. I'm not saying that that was why the Conservatives had lost successive elections. Combination of neglecting public services, being regarded as indifferent to the plight of the poor, and being judged to be hostile to ethnic and sexual minorities were all part of what was afflicting us. So I voted for equality. Ian himself, as leader, had started to make sympathetic noises on the subject of gay equality, and I had developed that theme, and then this vote came along, and I thought that this is a complete reversion into the lager. You know, this is a totally reactionary position to take. So of course I argued it out with Ian privately, but he wouldn't budge. He said he was under great pressure from more conservative forces, and he said, look, John, you know, this is a government proposal that's partly being put forward in order to sow the seeds of discord in our ranks, and you should just go away, you know, do something else that day, you can abstain or whatever. And you know, he probably thought it was unreasonable and cussed at me, but I said, well, I'm sorry, Ian, but the vote has come and I feel I must take my stand on the matter. It would be perfectly possible for you to give us a free vote on it, and I think you should, but he wouldn't. If I'm really honest about it, although I get on perfectly well now with Ian, and in many respects I have a lot of regard for Ian Duncan Smith, who's fundamentally a very decent man, I did not think that he was proving a success as leader. We had had various other disagreements. I didn't think that he was going to make it politically, and I thought that, you know, I suppose if you really believe in somebody, if Michael Portillo had led the Tory party at the time, I probably would have put up with more, because I believed that Michael had leadership skill. I felt that Ian was flailing, and the combination of that and the fact that I profoundly disagreed with him on this caused me to jump ship. Odd in one sense, Charles, because again, all part of my oddity, it meant quitting. It didn't mean abandoning my position on the whole. On the contrary, I stood my ground, and I made a speech in the debate and so on. But it meant quitting the front line. I'm not naturally a quitter, but I said to myself, well, look, I've got a choice. I can either stay on board, i.e. not quit, but effectively quit my political position, or I can stand my ground and accept the consequences. And to be honest, I was thoroughly disillusioned as a member of a shadow cabinet. I was a crap shadow minister anyway, and I thought, no, look, the time has come to go to the backbenches and argue my case, and I probably made myself even more unpopular in the Tory party by doing so than I had already been, but I've never had any regrets about it.
And you already...
And subsequently, the Tory party shifted its position. For example, Michael Howard, not a noted Liberal as far as I'm aware, and became a supporter of the civil partnership legislation, for which he deserves some credit. And, you know, I ought to be careful about what I say about current politics, but, you know, David Cameron and I are not exactly close buddies, but I've always thought that one of his finest achievements was to bring forward equal marriage legislation. He deserves great credit for that.
You'd already at that time had a very strong public reputation. You'd won awards, backbencher of the Stonewall Politician of the Year, partly because of what your stance, Hansard opposition MP of the year, backbencher to watch. You developed a reputation. You briefly returned to the front bench when Michael Howard became leader, but then left again because of a controversy of something you said about him. I think I'm not quite sure what it was, but I noticed. well, I know what it said. What it said was that you agreed with Anne Widdecombe, who described Michael Howard as having something of the night about him, and for some reason Michael Howard didn't appreciate that.
That's entirely true. I mean, that's entirely true. I mean, actually, the truth of the matter, if memory serves me correctly, it's all quite a long time ago, Charles, is that I had, rather recklessly, I think in the course of a letter about something else to the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, made a somewhat gratuitous reference, which I, in terms of basic loyalty to my party, I shouldn't have done. But I made a gratuitous reference to a superb speech that Blair had made the previous week in a debate on Iraq in the chamber, and I think somehow this was leaked or whatever. And apparently, although he didn't tell me at the time, Michael Howard was incandescent with rage because he took it as very much a criticism of him. On the occasion of the debate in question, Michael Howard had made a spectacularly bad speech, And therefore he probably felt particularly sensitive about it, because I think Michael knew that he'd made a bad speech, he miscalculated, he mishandled the House, he looked very shifty, possibly for the quite good reason that he was. And so, Michael probably felt a bit vulnerable anyway. He didn't say anything to me at the time, but then he knew he had the power, he was the leader, and when it came to a reshuffle on September the 8th, 2004, I think, he called me in. So the truth is, I wasn't sacked for that reason, he'd already sacked me. And what he said to me was, I don't want you to carry on as Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, but I would like you to continue to make a contribution. And so he had an idea in mind that I should be Shadow Secretary of State. There was no Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs, Shadow Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs. And I thought this was a completely bogus offer, a point subsequently vindicated when I discovered that at least 2 colleagues had previously rejected the post. And so I said, no, I have not the slightest interest in doing that job. I'm most grateful to you, Michael, but I have absolutely no interest whatsoever. And I said, but I do have I said, frankly, I'm very happy to go to the back benches. I've not much enjoyed the last few months under your leadership, if I may say so, and indeed whether I may or not, I am saying so. And so I said to him, but I do have some thoughts, if you don't mind. And he said, yeah. And I said, but I quite understand you've got a lot of other people to see. If you just want me to bugger off, I'll bugger off. He said, I do not address colleagues in those terms. You must give me your views. So I did give him my views, and I'm afraid I did say to him, frankly, I don't think you've even begun to compete with Tony Blair as a potential Prime Minister. Sorry. And I think it's a great mistake for you to go around and declare your intention to go around accusing him of being a liar over the war. And he said he did intend to do that. He intended to up the ante and do that. And I said, I think that's a great mistake. And he said, what makes you say that? And I said, because I think it's an example, Michael, of something that you're going to do that will make you feel better, but it will not be effective, because most voters don't like one politician calling another a liar. And he said, but it is objectively true. And I said, well, I don't think it is objectively true. I think that Tony's open to all sorts of criticism. I don't think he's lied. I don't think he's lied about Iraq at all, for reasons I'm happy to explain, but I don't think he's lied. But I said, but in any case, even if you think he has, let other people make that judgment for themselves. It won't work, and it will make you look very unpleasant. And so I said, that's the first point. And the second point, and I regret to say this, Michael, is that when I started serving under you, Anne Widdecombe said to me, you're going to have a rotten time. And I said, well, I don't agree with you. And I was on a journey to speak at a Cambridge Union debate with Anne, and she said, John, I like you personally, but it's going to be rotten and a miserable time. And I said, why? And she said, he's a bad man, as you're about to discover. And I said, well, I know you had a bad experience with it, but I don't agree with that. And I said, regrettably, over a period of months, in a number of scenarios in which we've had to deal with each other, Michael, increasingly I've come to the conclusion that Anne Widdecombe's verdict on you was right. And he said to me, you have spoken to me with brutal bluntness, he said. But to be fair to Michael, of whom I'm no great fan, as I think will be perfectly obvious, and to be fair to Michael, he was courteous. Yes. He heard me out, and then I was out.
You've described very eloquently your move from this ultra-right youth through across politics to thinking the Conservative Party itself had to change. You'd been involved with the Tory Reform Group, a relatively liberal group, and you'd shifted quite a lot as a result of political experience. By the way, I think that's a good thing. I think that people should change and think about things as things go on, rather than simply saying, I believe that then and I'm sticking with it. But my penultimate question is, there was talk at the time, rumours of you defecting to the Labour Party during that era. And as you know, when you're elected Speaker, which I'll come to in a moment,
sure,
you had a lot more support from the Labour side of the House than the Conservative side of the House. Could you just talk a little bit about this? Was there any truth in the idea you might actually have crossed the floor of the House? A very rare event. It's not something that happens very much at all. But even though, of course, you didn't do that at the end, did you find your loyalties, your sympathies, your outlook closer to Labour than to the Conservatives? Intrinsically a surprising thing to me, even though I knew fairly well. I found it surprising that was happening. Can you just talk through that process at that period? I'm talking really about from about 2006 or something like that through to about 2008, 2009.
Yes, I mean, the truth is that I was never tempted to defect, and I held no serious thought about doing so at any stage. People do in the House of Commons come up to you. There's quite a lot of cross-fertilisation, is perhaps not quite the right term between people of different parties, but certainly a lot of social interaction, which you don't necessarily see if you just witness the chamber. People do talk to each other, and people are on all-party groups together. People travel on select committee trips abroad and that sort of thing. So did people now and again say to me, I mean, it would just be surreal almost if they hadn't done, given my political trajectory, you know, John, why not join us? Yes, they did. But I don't think there was anything formal or orchestrated about it. If you mean, did I ever have, you know, secret negotiations? No. Michael Ancram once said to me that there was a Labour member whom he was keen, when he was party chairman, to woo to join the Conservative Party, and he very properly didn't go into the detail. He just said we weren't able to offer that person what was wanted, and therefore it didn't happen. There was nothing of that. There was no question of, you know, would I have gone if I'd been offered a particular post or anything like that. Absolutely not. I can say that categorically. Why didn't I want to leave? I very much admired, and this will be controversial, I very much admired Tony Blair. Having started out in Parliament hugely critical and almost excoriating about him, I came very greatly to admire Blair. I thought he was a most formidable and very impressive figure. Now, I know that his stock, you know, is probably not that high at the moment, largely as a result of Iraq. But to me, you know, he was a consummate politician, and far from being this rather sort of shifty figure, as demonised in Conservative propaganda, he was actually in many ways almost too principled for his own good from time to time. And so I was impressed by him. I didn't think he was typical of the Labour Party, and I didn't think that his legacy would necessarily endure. That was one factor. A second factor, Charles, was that I still felt fundamentally that I was a conservative in believing in capitalism and the free enterprise system, but I believed in free enterprise with social protection, and I was a very liberal Tory on social issues, not just on LGBT equality, but on abortion and a range of other matters, the death penalty and things like that as well. I suppose I still felt, well, I'm entitled to be a left-wing Tory in my own party and to try to bring it to its senses and to bring about the process of modernisation more quickly than seems likely to happen. And finally, and I hope colleagues understand this, friends understand this, you do feel a loyalty to your constituency party and your constituency. And so, you know, did the thought ever enter my mind? Well, yes, but, you know, I felt a basic loyalty to my Buckingham Conservative Association, some of whom were of liberal conservative disposition, and I enjoyed representing my area. It is true that although 90% of the time I voted with the Conservative Party, on issues about which I became very exercised, and it's only ever a small number about which you become very exercised, I often did find myself more in sympathy with and deriving greater support from people on the Labour in particular, and to a lesser extent, but not an insignificant extent, the Lib Dem benches. So did I contemplate defection? No, I didn't. Did I increasingly start to think on a lot of issues, I've got a lot of common ground with people from other parties on LGBT equality, on constitutional reform, and on the importance of reducing the gap, which I didn't used to think mattered, reducing the gap between rich and poor. Oh yes, very much so. And there were a lot of people on the Labour benches in that Labour government whom I came very greatly to admire, of whom, as you very well know, Charles, you were one. I was hopelessly inadequate on the Vehicles Crime Reduction Bill committee against you, but you did generously provide me with a tutorial on how to understand legislation.
That brings me to the really final big decision of your political life. In May 2009, your predecessor, Mr. Speaker Michael Martin, was forced by a set of events, which I don't think we need to revisit here, to stand down as Speaker, itself a very unusual event. You decided at that point that you would seek the office. I remember very well you coming to my office and trying to persuade me, as you were persuading others, that I should give you my vote, and quite legitimate it was too. It was a process where you were elected, and it's a new thing that's happened in recent years, is that process. But what took you to think, right, I've been in the Conservative Party, I've gone through this process, I could have possibly been a cabinet minister doing something in some field of office if the Conservatives came back to power. You could have, but you just explained you wouldn't have thought of doing that, joined the Labour Party and tried to find something that way. You thought, no, I'm going to have a shot at being Mr. Speaker. What was your thought processes that took you to that?
My thought process was that I had lost all interest in becoming a minister. I had had a rather strange career, oscillating back and forth, as you have observed. The truth was that when I was on, I wasn't consistent about it. You know, I genuinely had, not agonies of indecision, but constant reflection on what I was to do. When I was on the backbenches, after a period, pursuing issues of interest to me, I nevertheless quite fancied the chance of being on the front. And when I was on the front bench, with all the disciplines of collective responsibility, even in opposition, and it's less strong, less intense, less demanding, less exacting in opposition than it is with the iron laws of collective responsibility in government, nevertheless those disciplines exist. And I thought, I don't like this, I'm not comfortable with this, and I'd rather be on the backbench. And, you know, I shouldn't, and I don't, decry the leaders of the Conservative Party at the time, but the truth is I didn't really think any of them was going to make it, and I didn't really think any of them quite passed muster. William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, or Michael Howard. And by the time David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party, I was pretty clear in my mind, A, that I didn't want to be a minister. I wasn't good at this collective responsibility business. I was too selfishly committed to being able to speak out on whatever mattered to me at the time. I also thought, not only would I not be very good at being a minister, but I was quite spectacularly unlikely to be asked by David Cameron to be a minister, because just because I'd been rather rude to Michael Howard, and during the Conservative leadership election I was supporting Ken in 2005, and at one point, you won't remember this, but at one point in the campaign when David Cameron was behind, he made a late surge, he was actually behind, and he launched a rather ill-tempered attack on Ken, and I think I was the Ken Clarke person due to be on the media that weekend. I was interviewed by Steve Richards on his Sunday programme. And I was asked about this, and I said, well, David needs to calm down, take some sort of sedative, and you'll probably find it beneficial. He's becoming rather overwrought. He's a young man, and he's obviously struggling a bit in this contest, and the pressure is getting to him a bit. It's all very unfortunate. But I was asked about David, and I think I said rather bluntly, well, you know, Eton, Oxford, hunting, shooting, fishing, and lunch at White's doesn't strike me as a particularly ideal combination if you're trying to communicate with the vast mass of people who owe no allegiance to any of those institutions or practices whatsoever. Not surprisingly, I think David Cameron was sort of rather underwhelmed by this observation. So, you know, I thought, well, I'm not going to be any good as a minister. I'm not going to be asked to be a minister. Damn it, I've got to resolve this once and for all. Otherwise, to be honest, it's a recipe, apart from anything else, it's a recipe for unhappiness and for failure. And so I said to myself, I'm not going to return to the front bench, even if I'm asked, and I wasn't. But I'm not going to return to the front bench. What I'm going to do is try to get myself on the Speaker's panel of chairmen, and Michael Martin and Alan Hazelhurst were very accommodating, they put me on. I'm going to beaver away, doing my panel duties, chairing bill committees, legislation committees, debates in the subsidiary chamber of Westminster Hall, which you have to do as a member of the Speaker's panel of chairmen. I'll pursue my areas of interest, probably rather iconoclastically, and at such time as the speakership comes vacant, I'll have a go. Charles, you'll all make your own assessment. The only point, I'm not really sort of particularly interested in defending myself, the only point I would make, if I may, is this. What I did honestly. I may be reckless, I might be foolish, you might think I'm a flibbertigibbet or whatever, but it was done honestly. And what is not true is the thesis, if it can be dignified with that term, of what I call the bigot faction represented by the Daily Fail and others, that I sort of tacked and weaved to the left. And of course it also satisfies their rather sort of, I was going to say chauvinistic, I would say misogynistic view that, you know, the little woman, or in my case the tall woman, behind the scenes is busily manipulating the situation. You know, their view is, well, you know, this fellow Bercow, oily, sort of unreliable character that he is, you know, moved left, encouraged by his plotting, scheming wife, and decided to shift leftwards in order to get Labour support so that he could become Speaker. I mean, you know, some of those people are rather demented. No, I mean, I had honest changes of heart. When I then came to stand for Speaker, you know, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, but I think it is legitimate to campaign. There used to be a very old-fashioned, rather sort of toffish view Anybody who sort of wants a thing too much is probably rather sort of probably rather a cad. A sort of bull at a gate sort of fellow. You know, we don't want. And the idea that one might campaign for a role was thought to be sort of slightly inappropriate. Bugger it. You know, there was a contest. I stood, and you know, did I say to Labour MPs who came up to me in some cases in droves, saying, "John, it's got to be a Tory this time. You know, you're an ordinary bloke. You're state educated. You're of rather liberal disposition. You know, frankly, we quite like you. We'll vote for you." Did I say, "Oh no, please don't vote for me"? Well, you know, one of those pigs I see flying in front of my very eyes. I didn't say that, and who would have done? You know, dare I say it? Yes, I stood, and I actually wanted to win. Is that a sin?
John, I've taken much too much of the time of this whole meeting. It's been absolutely gripping. We've now got about 20 minutes, I would say, of questions from the people who are here, and as always I'm going to take them in groups of 3. So who'd like to kick off? There's somebody up there, right there. Where are the mics? We've got roving mics somewhere. We've got one roving mic over there. Yes, that's right. That's the person there. Then I saw somebody that side. The woman just here next to the guy in the blue shirt, and then behind, further back, the gentleman up there. That's right, you. So could you just give your name as usual and before you ask your question?
Okay. Hello, my name is Stephen Levan. Can you hear this?
Stephen?
Lavan.
Lavan,
Okay.
yes.
Mr. Speaker, one thing that impressed me listening to you is that I find so many politicians just toe the party line. Like Anne Widdecombe, like David Davis, you don't do that. I like that. I think a lot of people like that and wish that more people were like that. But with all the things you did and all your achievements, you then decide, it strikes me, to put yourself in the most difficult of positions. Mr. Speaker, what a difficult job. And, of course, a Tory, Mr. Speaker, and not necessarily all the Conservatives on your side. Was that a difficult decision?
Thank you. The lady just there, that's right, you.
I know you're very committed to modernising the House of Commons, and one of your efforts to undertake that came slightly unstuck when one of the people you appointed was then routed. I wonder if you could comment further on both of those issues.
Yes.
Modernisation and tactics in the House of Commons.
Yes, with pleasure.
Thank you. And there's a third just up there. There was a hand went up just... thought I saw them just there. Yes, that gentleman there, sorry.
My question is possibly superfluous.
Could you just give your name, please?
My name is Tim Corkwell. This may be superfluous because I really wanted to ask about your views on constitutional reform, but that's would come out of your answer to the question just given, I think. But anything you could say about how you think the Constitution should be reformed, if it should be reformed, would be interesting.
Thank you. Right, okay, the first question, well, you know, you sort of landed up as Speaker and not necessarily with much Conservative support. You put yourself in a difficult position. Why that? Well, I suppose the answer to you, sir, is that historically, for long periods, as you could discover if you read the works of the distinguished historian Linda Colley, not much happened in Parliament, just as there were periods in which a lot happened. And for long periods, likewise, the expectation was that the Speaker would simply chair the proceedings in the chamber, and it was a case pretty much of job done. At the time that I was seeking election, and for a period probably of at least a year running up to that, though I confess I'd already decided I was interested, there was very heavy debate on how we needed to reform ourselves in Parliament. And I thought that in standing for Speaker, it wasn't principally about trying to bring about a change in the expenses system. That was going to be done independently. Rather, I said to colleagues, look, if any of you here believes that all we need to do is to replace an antiquated and overly generous and excessively secretive expenses system with one characterised by equity, audit, transparency and accountability, you're deluded on an industrial scale. We need to do a lot more than that in Parliament. And I thought that the Speaker, working principally with others, there's not much the Speaker could do on his own or her own, the Speaker could help to reform Parliament. And I suppose the thing that would just underline is I've always been passionate, despite all my inconsistencies and vicissitudes of fortune, I've always been passionate about Parliament. So I stood for Speaker, fully recognising then, and certainly appreciating now, that a lot of people say, but you're effectively a political eunuch as Speaker. You don't speak in the chamber other than as Speaker. You can't speak in debates, you can't vote, you can't table motions. I thought, no, but I could help to bring about a change agenda. Faster progress at question time, granting more urgent questions when ministers fail to offer statements to the House, and making the case for the election of the chairs of select committees that scrutinise the executive rather than having the people that scrutinise the executive hand-picked by representatives of the executive, establishing a backbench business committee that would choose the subjects and allocate the time for their debate at least once a week, ensuring the election of the deputy speakers so that they command the confidence of the House. Now, all of those things have since happened. So the short answer to your question is that the reason why I wanted to be Speaker was that I thought that it was an opportunity to lead a process with others of genuine parliamentary reform. And what I said is I want to catapult the backbencher from the stalls of parliamentary life to centre stage. Amongst all our problems, one of our big problems is that over the post-war period, the power of government under successive administrations has grown, is growing, and needs to be reduced, of which the corollary is that the power of Parliament, which is not the same as the executive, has decreased, is decreasing, and ought to be increased. And I think that we have made some worthwhile changes in that regard. In relation to the lady in the 6th row, whatever, who said, well, you know, I tried to modernise, but I'd also come unstuck on a particular appointment. You're absolutely right. I have tried to modernise, not just in the sense of chamber reforms, which have come about with support from other people, not just myself. I have tried to look at the House as an employer and a World Heritage Site. I thought it absolutely ridiculous when I stood for election in 2009 that we had a shooting gallery on the parliamentary estate, but no nursery that MPs or staff could pay for in order to improve the work-life balance and ensure their children were looked after while they were doing their jobs. I'm pleased to say 6 years later, we have a very well-subscribed, highly successful, increasingly popular nursery, but we have no shooting gallery. But at first I was told, oh, it's an absolutely splendid idea in principle, Mr. Speaker, but in practice it can't be done because there's no suitable site. There's no suitable site. And I said I didn't believe that. I was told a paper would be written for me with a list of possibilities, and I thought, this is very Humphrey, I'm going to be told that none of them works. And the chap said he would go around and look at possible sites and report back. And I said, no, we won't do that. We'll go together. And we identified some sites, and eventually, with terrific support from Harriet Harman in particular, but also David McLean, who was a Conservative on the House of Commons Commission, which I chair, who felt that the Speaker, it wasn't particularly out of deference to me. I don't think David felt any deference to me. He'd been my chief whip at one time. And no, David McLean felt the Speaker ought to have what the Speaker wanted on the whole. And we got that change. We now have an education centre that will allow more than a doubling of young people to come to Parliament and learn about the journey to rights and representation. I've insisted everybody on the parliamentary estate, whether they are employed by or working as a contractor to the House, must be paid at least the London living wage. I've supported the growth, the establishment and growth of workplace equality networks across the House. I think those things matter. They say something about the DNA of the House as an employer. So, you know, I'm not apologetic about any of that. I did run into trouble, as you very rightly say. I, put very simply, had a view to which I subscribe and which has largely come about, that the clerks in the House of Commons are extremely important servants of the House, but they are procedural specialists, and they ought to stick to their last, if I can put it that way, and focus on that specialism. In my opinion, the idea that the clerk should also be the chief executive of the House, responsible for the wider management of the House, the treatment of staff, the delivery of services, our outward-facing role, was incongruous, because the clerks, frankly, had worked for 40 years in the House, had no experience. I decided to appoint someone who had, frankly, more chief executive experience than clerkly experience, and the House revolted against that. We ended up with the Straw Committee, Jack Straw's committee, looking at the management of the House, and Jack recommended, I'm very delighted to say, what I had argued for but failed to secure. Andrew Lansley, as leader of the House, very strongly resisted what I was arguing for, but Jack in the end recommended a split of the roles. So we have a clerk and we have now a Director General of the House of Commons. The way I went about it could have been improved upon. I probably should have fought longer and harder and earlier for a split in the roles. I didn't get it, and I then thought, well, I'll appoint the person I favour anyway, and there was a revolt against that. So did I make tactical errors? I think I did, but I'm pleased with the overall outcome. In terms of constitutional reform, I'm agnostic about the question of whether we should have a written constitution. There are arguments for it, but I don't feel a religious zealotry in favour of it. On parliamentary reform, I still think we should have a House Business Committee that all government business should be determined by, which the government should have a majority on, but which should have opposition and backbench representatives as well. I don't think it should be determined just by the whips behind the scenes. I admit I'm biased in that matter. When I was a backbencher and a frontbencher, I had a relationship with the Tory whips characterised by trust and understanding. I didn't trust them and they didn't understand me. On House of Lords reform, sir, let me just say to you, when I was free to express an opinion and could be relied upon regularly to do so on the subject of Lords reform, and I was in favour of a wholly or predominantly elected second chamber, and now that I'm not free to express an opinion on those matters, I don't, and I leave you to judge whether I'm particularly likely to have changed my view. I think in the last Parliament, the government mishandled the situation, because I think saying we're going to have an elected second chamber, but don't worry, the House of Commons will still be the primary chamber, was what I call argument by advocacy rather than by evidence. What the government really needed to do was to put something in the legislation which underscored the continuing primacy of the Commons, but they didn't do so. Quite a lot of Tory MPs, in any case, and I don't mean this that they behaved dishonourably, they didn't, but they were looking for a reason to reject an elected second chamber, and they took their chance to kill off the measure. If you're asking me, do I think that we're going to get an elected second chamber any time soon, I would say, don't hold your breath.
Can I just add one point before the other question? Constitutional reform is very, very difficult, and because of all the countervailing pressures. And John, I think you deserve great credit, because unlike, I think, any of your predecessors, at least that I'm aware of, you set about the process of reforming and modernising the House of Commons in a subtle way that has seen some very significant changes that have happened. I myself think the most important is your granting of urgent questions, so-called. Just to explain, it's the way in which the government of the day is forced to come to the House and explain what it's doing, and it's entirely up to the Speaker's discretion as to whether he forces the government to come or not. But the government does have to come if the Speaker says you've got to come. And you've been far, far more positive about that, and that's changed the whole culture of things, not to mention some of the other reforms you made. So
well,
I don't underestimate what it has taken for you, John, Mr. Speaker, to make many of the changes which have happened under your period of office. And I only say that because looking at the way that last government set about its constitutional reform agendas, for example, reform of the House of Lords, the alternative vote and so on, they just didn't think about how to make happen what they thought should happen, in my opinion.
Charles, can I just say, before we take the other question, I'd just say on the subject of urgent questions, by the way, this isn't intended to treat the subject with levity, that objections can happen under both governments. I came very much to admire Ed Balls. I worked with Ed Balls on speech, language and communication issues, partly on the back of my wife and I discovering we had a child with speech and language difficulties. And so I'm one of those people who rather likes and admires Ed. But I remember early in my speakership that I was considering an application for a UQ relating to the appointment of the Children's Commissioner, and Ed Balls phoned me up. I didn't know what it was about, but it turned out to be basically to say why this question shouldn't be granted. And I was slightly taken aback because there was a process of written submission from the department. So I was a little surprised that he called, although apparently it had been quite a common practice for him or somebody to do so before I became Speaker, with whatever results. But I said to him, well, you know, the matter will be considered at the meeting, you know, Ed, in the proper way. But he explained why he didn't think it should be granted. And I said I didn't think that argument was compelling. Anyway, I granted it. To Ed's credit, he never raised it again. But more recently, a very senior minister in the present government wrote to me to explain why he thought I was wrong to grant an urgent question on a particular subject. I better not say which subject, otherwise it will be obvious which minister, and I'd rather not at this stage say that. But anyway, I did write back to him to say that I was extremely grateful. He's a person with very, very burdensome responsibilities. I was extremely grateful to him for taking the trouble to give me his views on this matter. And however, the House had entrusted me with the responsibility to determine it rather than he, and therefore he would have to rest content with the results. Goodbye.
Next three questions. Gentleman there, woman there, let's come over the other side. No hands on that side. The gentleman on the aisle in red. Okay, first was up there, I think.
Mr. Speaker,
Sorry,
thank
there,
you.
that's right.
How do you manage the... sorry, I need to introduce myself. Miles Smith. How do you manage the egos at question time?
How do I manage the
Egos.
Egos at question time.
egos at question time? Okay, thank you.
And then the lady just here. That's right. That row, and she's in. That's right.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Kate Wood. We had Caroline Lucas here a few weeks ago, and she was talking about Westminster being full of asbestos and the Houses of Parliament generally crumbling around people.
I didn't hear. Full of.
Sorry.
Asking about the crumbling House of Commons and asbestos.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
asbestos. I beg your
Which
pardon.
Caroline
Sorry.
Lucas drew attention to when
Yes.
she was here.
Yeah,
a couple of weeks ago.
there you go. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if she suggested maybe moving sort of like the House of Parliament sort of out north, so that it was less of like a London, powerhouse and distributing power. And I wondered what your thoughts were.
Thank you.
Okay, and gentleman in the red jumper on the aisle.
Hello, my name's Daniel Bardsley. I just wondered how you thought the whole English votes for English laws issue would play out, and whether you thought there was inevitable that ultimately there'd be an English Parliament.
Thank you. And in relation to Miles, how do I manage egos? Well, I'm not sure that I do. I mean, I think that on the whole, most people, ladies and gentlemen, are fair-minded and they take the rough with the smooth. In other words, and this is how I choose to interpret your question, they accept that sometimes when they want to speak, they will be called to do so, either to ask a question or to make a speech, and other times they won't. But, there are not large scale, but quite regular expressions of regret, let's say, and in some cases of very active discontent at not being called. I mean, yesterday, obviously I won't say who, yesterday there was an opposition member who was aggrieved not to be called, and he explained that he had various commitments as a parliamentary private secretary and was therefore able to come into the chamber only from time to time, and he'd waited an hour and not been called, and he was clearly very discontented. He came up to the chair to say so, and I said, well, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to get everybody in. We've not finished. If you stay, you'll get in. Oh no, I've got to go now, he said. Well, I'm sorry, and I don't sort of bear any ill will towards the fellow for saying that. At least he was sort of honest about it. But forgive me saying so, but in the past, it was not particularly common for everyone to get called on a government statement. They would typically run for 45 minutes or possibly an hour, but very rarely longer. Today, the Prime Minister came to the House and gave a statement about Syria and his plan of campaign, so to speak. The statement started at 10:30. He spoke for just under 20 minutes and then took questions, first from Jeremy Corbyn and then from everybody else. He left the chamber at 1:15 because I wanted, on this momentous matter, everybody to have a chance to question him. I don't always call everybody, but I very often do, and therefore things run on. So I took the view that the subsequent business was much less salient, not unimportant, but less salient and less pressing, and the priority was to ensure on this big issue everyone had a chance to be heard. So, if a chap sort of says, or a chapess says, oh, well, I've got to go now because I've got a meeting. Well, you've got to prioritise the chamber. If you don't want to prioritise the chamber, so be it, but don't complain about not being called. A while ago, there was a member, and I think probably Charles will guess who this is, quite an experienced member from a northern constituency on the Labour benches. He's a very committed parliamentarian. He's been in the House since 1979. But he came up to me on a day when we had 3 question time sessions, and he said, Mr. Speaker, you carved me out. You censored me. And I said, I beg your pardon, I called you on each of the first 2 question times. Oh yeah, he said, but I wasn't much bothered about those. It was the third one that was of interest. And I said, well, call me quaint or old-fashioned, but you stood the first 2 times, and therefore I rather assumed you wished to give the House the benefit of your views, or at any rate to ask a question. So, you can't please everybody, but basically, you just have to do your best. And most people accept that on the whole, the chair doesn't have friends or foes, and the chair does its best to accommodate people. Now, the second question...
The house falling down and
the house
possibly
falling
going
down.
elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't agree with Caroline about that. I respect her view. By the way, she's proved to be a terrific parliamentarian. I mean, she's won a number of awards for her work, and I respect her greatly. She's tough and articulate and feisty, and she's in a minority of one in the Commons, but she really does maximise her effectiveness. So I respect her very much. I'm afraid I don't agree that we should go out of London. I think that basically I'm against decanting fully, and if we can possibly avoid it. We may have to decant in part. Why am I against full decant? And broadly speaking, because I subscribe to the doctrine of the occupied field, and I fear that if the field comes to be occupied by someone else, whatever you put in the contracts with the contractors, the incentive for them to finish on time is much reduced. And you could have people serving their whole parliamentary careers never serving in the Commons. So we may have to shift people out, and will, including from offices and so on. I certainly think we should preserve a chamber in the parliamentary estate. And why don't I think we should go out of London? It's often said, oh, well, perhaps we should. I think it's inescapable that government is based in London. And I think in practical terms, even with the advance of modern technology, the idea that we could have a parliamentary base, the parliamentary base, potentially tens of miles or even hundreds of miles away from where all government departments are situated, seems to me to be implausible. So I respect her view, but I'm afraid I don't agree with it. And then, thirdly, English votes for English laws. How do I see that panning out? I don't think it's inevitable that we'll have an English Parliament. We've recently, this is very sort of inward-looking stuff, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me, but recently, the government said, the Conservative government said, well, we said that we would deliver English votes for English laws, and they therefore decided to bring forward an arrangement whereby the Speaker would be expected to certify laws or statutory instruments, secondary legislation, or clauses thereof, if not the whole bill or the whole instrument, as being England or Wales only, being England only, effectively. And I was asked by the Procedure Committee for my views about that. I wasn't inspired, I wasn't losing any sleep over it, I wasn't inspired by the idea. When the government sort of said, oh, well, the Speaker already has powers to select amendments, for example, to legislation, and that the Speaker already certifies if something's a money bill, and therefore it was just a natural extension. I said, no, I'm afraid the difference in scale is so great as to involve virtually a difference in principle. It draws the Speaker potentially into matters of controversy from which he should ideally be kept away. So I wasn't enthusiastic about that, but I accepted the government had a right to do it if it wanted. And I did also say that if the government wants to entrust it to me to decide whether something is England only or not, I'll take advice from clerks and the Speaker's counsel, who's a respected lawyer, but they'll just have to rest content with my judgment. And I think that the burden of proof will have to be very strong. Now, there have been some completely uncontentious cases recently where I have certified something as England only. There haven't been matters of great controversy, but all I would say, without prejudicing the consideration of any subsequent bill or statutory instrument, is that I think that the case has to be extremely strong to justify making a judgment that would adversely affect a proportion of members sitting in the House of Commons. Do I think an England-only Parliament is inevitable or essential? I don't. And although I understand why this logic has developed, I would just bid you to bear in mind that we are still supposed to be a unitary Parliament. And yes, we have Scottish devolution and Welsh devolution as well, but I don't think that this logic should be pursued inexorably. You might end up saying, oh, well, so-and-so is a London-only matter, or so-and-so is a Yorkshire-only matter. No, there should be an integrity and a unitary character to Parliament as a whole. So I think that, separatist forces should not be given undue encouragement.
Just one final point about your style. You've developed a style. It's not just the order, but when somebody appears to step out of line, you address them very, very directly, often apparently with medical expertise. You mentioned taking the tablets in an exchange with David Cameron, and yesterday we had our own Member of Parliament here was rebuked by you for his behaviour in the statement, in the autumn statement from George Osborne. You said you thought he should take up yoga, and that was the way to do it. Now, do you actually have any medical expertise, or do you have insights which help you interpret how members should operate in a way that accords with your desires?
No, I have absolutely no medical expertise whatsoever. You know, you can't win because some people will like it and some people won't. You know, you try to deploy a little bit of humour. I did once say, actually, the first member I said that to some years ago was a man called Tom Blenkinsop, who, you know, is a strong-minded character from Middlesbrough, and I think I suggested to him that he might usefully take up yoga. And anyway, what happened was that his brother bought him a book on the subject of yoga, which the opposition chief whip asked me as a Christmas present, which she asked me to sign. And I did but I'm afraid I did on a fairly recent occasion say to Tom Blenkinsop, I say to the honourable gentleman that his brother may have bought him the book on yoga, but there's not the slightest evidence that he's even proceeded to read chapter 1. Look, perhaps I can just conclude, Charles, by saying, look, if this is the last question and you have to move on, I quite understand. It's been huge fun. And you asked me earlier about tennis. My office is probably bored stiff with my obsessive passion for tennis. But, by the way, I'm going to watch the Davis Cup final this weekend, and I'll be cheering on the Murray brothers in Ghent, all being well. But actually, my hero is Roger Federer. I adore watching Federer. I watch him usually on television, but otherwise at Wimbledon or the O2, and I saw him play in Paris this year, and I've been lucky enough to meet him a couple of times, which I regard as a great joy. He's my hero. But actually from the past, and one of the things that really inspired me is this concept that you never give up. You know, you just keep fighting. Churchill used to say KBO, keep buggering on. In the 50s and 60s, there was a very great Mexican-American tennis player called Pancho Gonzalez, whom some of the older people in the audience may remember. Gonzalez was a great champion. But anyway, after he passed his best, and Charles, and sadly I never met Gonzalez, but sadly for me, and when I wrote my book on tennis greats, a book called Tennis Maestros, about 18 months ago, I did a chapter on Gonzalez. And I heard this story about Gonzalez when I was very young from my tennis coach. And it always inspired me, not just in tennis, though certainly in tennis, but in life. He said, John, in 1969, when Gonzalez was 41 and passed his best, but still a good player, at Wimbledon, he came up against a guy called Charlie Passerelle, who was a very good American player, but not a world beater. And Gonzalez lost the first set in the days when there was no tiebreak, 24-22. And the second set, he lost 6-1, and he was fulminating and cursing and swearing, complaining bitterly to the umpire and the tournament referee that bad light should have stopped play. But the referee insisted that play continue, and Gonzalez lost the second set 6-1, and then they retired for the night. So he left the court jeered by the crowd for his behaviour. 22-24, 1-6 down. He came back the following day. He won the third set 16-14 and the fourth 6-3. And he saved 7 match points, including twice being love 40 down on his own serve, 3 match points down in succession. And he eventually won the final set 11-9. And he came off the court, and an interviewer said to him, well, you know, Pancho, that was the most amazing Houdini-like escape. But surely, you know, when you were 2 sets down, and when you had all those match points against you, you must have thought Charlie had you beaten. To which Gonzalez, as quick as a flash, replied, hell no, I just thought Charlie was being stubborn. Well, I'm stubborn too. And that's motivated me throughout life.
John, very good.
Yeah, very good. Are you happy, sir? Very good. Very good.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you can tell from the response how much people have appreciated hearing your very direct, candid, open description of your life in politics and where you've been. It's been an honour to host you here at UEA. We're really delighted that you've come, and I remind you that the original cause of the whole of this series has been to encourage young people in particular to feel that going into politics is worthwhile and that you can achieve things in that. Yeah. The story that you've told, the stories you've told, illustrates that as clearly as you possibly could want to see. A boy who came from a pretty ordinary background, doing pretty ordinary things, then achieving outstanding changes and outstanding achievements all round. It's tremendous. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you indeed. It's been tremendous. Just to say, our final one in this series will be this time next week, next Thursday, with Caroline Flint, who ran for the deputy leadership of the Labour Party in the leadership elections that took place earlier this year, and also has the distinction of having been a student here at UEA. Thank you all very much for coming this evening.
Thank you.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Good. I think it was great.
I hope it worked all right.
Was there a lot